this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 1113 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into this week's mailbag questions, I just want to send another reminder to check out the Late Round Draft Guide. There's over 270 pages of content that includes game theory, strategy, ways to spot breakouts and busts, players to target, players to avoid, and more. You get cheat sheets in the guide, which includes a cheat sheet of our new market score metric. It's all updated weekly directly to your email inbox. Check it out and learn more over on lateround.com. The first question this week is from Troy from the Members Hub. It says, "Hey JJ, sorry for the lengthy question. I have picked 12 in my 12-team league. In these early mocks, I often find myself taking some combination of Genty, Barkley, Hampton, Chase Brown at the 1-2 turn due to there being much more quality running backs there than wide receivers. At the 3-4 turn, I'm often taking Devontae, Flowers, Ladd, Higgins, Burden. My question is, do you feel comfortable going into the season with your top wideouts being from that tier?" The short answer is yes, I'm fine with that. I'm a huge fan of that tier of wide receivers for upside purposes. So if you're throwing multiple darts at it, you're increasing your odds of hitting on one of those players. I also think double tapping running back at the back end of drafts this year is a super strong approach. You've got to spend money to make money at running back. I say it in the draft guide every year. The elite players at the position, the ones who are giving you a huge edge in fantasy football, they're almost always drafted early. Now you get a similar dynamic at wide receiver, don't get me wrong. But as you noted, the quality of fantasy player at that stage in the draft is much more attractive at running back than it is wide receiver. Now, scoring, lineup settings, that all should dictate which direction you go in. But let it be known that you shouldn't feel uncomfortable with this approach given the upside that you can get at wide receiver in that 3-4 turn area. Not only that, in non-best ball environments, you'll have a chance to potentially get another good upside receiver in round 5. That's honestly how I would approach a lot of normal drafts from the 11 or 12 spot this year. This next question is also from the Members Hub. It's from @Illmatic27. It says, "Hi JJ, I have a question. What's your take on drafting 2 quarterbacks in redraft leagues that start only 1 quarterback? Say the roster's 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, 1 flex, and 6 bench spots. Is it worth using a bench spot on a second quarterback in this type of league? And if so, under what circumstances? For example, if I land Allen or Lamar, I feel like grabbing another one late isn't worth it. But if I take Malik Willis at the end, would it be better to pair him with a high floor quarterback like Goff, or instead go for an upside guy like Tyler Shuck or Cam Ward as a second quarterback? Thanks." I feel like there's an idea out there, because I hear about this a lot, that I'm totally against rostering 2 quarterbacks in fantasy football. It couldn't be further from the truth. I've even had seasons of the draft guide where I wrote about doing this exact same thing, getting 2 later round quarterbacks as opposed to spending up on 1. When you take a quarterback early, you're taking on a massive opportunity cost. That's obviously the downside. It's not that we don't want Josh Allen on our fantasy teams. It's that drafting Josh Allen means you're missing out on some really good running backs and wide receivers. But this is a little like the question before. You can take multiple players at a discount at a particular position, and when you take multiple players, you're increasing your odds of hitting on one of those players. This is why we don't just roster fill when we're drafting our fantasy teams. You'll see in a lot of inexperienced rooms where people just draft a running back, they draft another one, they get a couple of wide receivers, and then they say, "Oh, I've got to get my quarterback and tight end because they're in my starting lineup. I'll draft them right now." The obvious problem with that is that they're not considering hit rates and where they can get the same caliber players later in the draft. You're not guaranteed your pick hitting when you draft them. If you take Luther Burden, you're not guaranteed that Burden ends up hitting. But if you get Burden and then you draft Jalen Waddle, then you're increasing your chances of getting a good wide receiver on your team. It's not all reliant on Burden, but you've got a chance now with Waddle too. It's no different at quarterback. Your goal is to get an every week starter. Your goal is not to stream the position. That's the fallback plan. And one way to do that is to draft 2 higher upside quarterbacks late. You won't take on a high cost. the cost is essentially a bench spot. This is much easier to do in deeper leagues, for sure. Like I did the Kings Classic last week at the Fantasy Football Expo, where we have 14 teams in the league and it's really deep rosters. Because of that, quarterback matters a little bit less. We have 2 running backs in our starting lineup, 3 wide receivers, 3 flex spots, and 1 tight end. The demand grows for these non-quarterback positions, and that makes quarterback less valuable in that kind of format. Now, it's a sharp room, so Josh Allen fell in the draft, but I didn't pounce. I instead waited and I waited because I really do think the quarterback position is very deep this year. That's what I did that episode on the late round quarterback strategy just a couple of weeks ago. But people started taking backup quarterbacks before I had my starter. That's when I knew I had to go after my quarterback. Otherwise, there's a chance I could have been locked out at the position. So what did I do? Well, I was at the 101 spot and at the 12-13 turn. And remember, this is a 14-team league. So it's a deep part of the draft where the pick before was Isaac Tesla and the pick after my quarterback was Emmett Johnson. But actually, I double tapped quarterback. I got Bo Nix and then I got Tyler Shuck. I got a relatively stable piece who still has some upside in Bo Nix and then the pure upside play in Shuck. So if you're thinking about getting Malik Willis this year, which I think a lot of you guys should, I like pairing Malik Willis with a more stable piece. It doesn't have to be another late round quarterback. Because generally speaking, really good quarterbacks, the stable quarterbacks, Jared Goff, maybe Brock Purdy even, who I do have ranked well ahead of Goff, those guys are still going to go pretty late in your drafts. So you can absolutely pair that kind of player with Malik Willis. So yes, the TLDR here is that you can definitely get 2 quarterbacks, especially if it's in a deep draft where the waiver wire won't be filled with great starters. Where the backup plan, the fallback plan, it's not as easy to stream. Just make sure that you're not spending up at the position. Get 2 guys late. This next question is from @J_S_Stoph on Twitter. It says, I remember an episode a couple of years ago where you laid out that taking a running back in around 7 to 10-ish when they had a teammate going in the dead zone was a good bet. Has that data still been supported the last couple of seasons, and how does it translate to 2026? So on one hand, I'm happy that I've been able to come up with new ideas and new research over the years. But on the other hand, the problem with research is that it evolves. And some people remember something that you did like 5 years ago, and that something has just changed, gotten better, or it's just not relevant anymore. The idea at a high level here generally is not wrong. But I've stopped talking about the dead zone in that way. And I've stopped having round cutoffs in that way. Because it doesn't allow people to be loose and reactive when they draft. They're too confined. The idea here, though, is that when a middle round running back has a teammate who isn't being drafted super high, like as a top 12, top 18 running back, that often is giving us some information. It's what I've always called ambiguous backfields. The starter might be kind of clear, but it's not totally clear. Otherwise, that starter probably would have been going earlier in the draft. Or the middle round running back wouldn't be a middle round running back. He'd be a late round running back. But also think of it this way. If you have 2 running backs from the same team that are being drafted in like the top 36, let's say, and the RB1 out of those 2 backs is getting selected maybe at RB20, the RB2 maybe at RB35. That's telling us that the offensive situation is probably pretty good. The market is drafting 2 running backs from the same offense with relatively high draft capital. Now we know as the season goes on, a lot of these backfields, they just stay split. That's one of the problems from an interpretation standpoint that we run into with the ambiguous backfield idea. It's not that one of the players in the backfield will definitely emerge. It's that they do at a relatively decent rate, at a better rate than a handcuff or a backup to an elite running back would, whether due to just talent beating out talent or an injury to one of the other running backs. There are multiple outs for one of those ambiguous backfield backs. And if there are multiple outs in a good offense, then that means there's a lot of upside. But you don't need to look at this through the lens of dead zone or not dead zone. You can generally look at it as, is he backing up an elite player? And then you can also do what I do in the draft guide, which is relate that player's backfield to expected fantasy points by ADP. That expected fantasy points number is driven by ADP of the running backs in that backfield. So hopefully that helps. I'm trying to be a little bit less confined with the parameters these days because it gives you a little bit more flexibility when you're drafting. We just need to understand the idea at a high level. It's just a smarter way to do things, in my opinion. This next question is from Nick. It says, I'm wondering how a chopped league changes draft strategy or the opportunity cost equation. I got pick 18 of 18 and am thinking about if a onesie position such as Brock Bowers becomes better or worse in the format. On one hand, I understand an early onesie with this many teams is less than optimal. On the other hand, players I am passing on will be re-entering the player pool, plus I can almost completely eliminate tight end from my free agent auction budget. Thanks for all the hard work you do. So for anyone who doesn't know, in a chopped league or a guillotine league, you typically start with 18 teams and one team, the lowest scoring team, gets eliminated each week. That person's team then goes on to waivers and everyone can bid on those players the following week. So part of the question here is saying, if I have Brock Bowers, I won't have to care about going after tight ends when I go get players off waivers. But you're missing half the story here. You're only looking at it from the angle of Brock Bowers. You're not looking at it from the angle of, why can't the Brock Bowers team lose in a given week, allowing you a chance to get Bowers with your free agent budget? Or worst case scenario, why can't I, the team who drafts Brock Bowers, be the one who loses? The bottom line is that you're answering this question with your own question. You know that a onesie position is suboptimal with more teams in your league, because more teams means you're drafting even more running backs and wide receivers than you typically would. Double or even triple sometimes the rate as tight ends. Going with a player like Bowers, who I absolutely love this year, it's a high risk move when you want the opposite in this format, because you have a 94% chance to advance in week 1 and a greater than 90% chance to advance for most of the season. The opportunity cost becomes greater to take on Bowers. I don't think he's attractive in that kind of format. Just like a player like Josh Allen's not attractive. There's too big of a cost involved. So I would not get cute and overthink it. This next question is from Mike. It says, hey JJ, love the show. So Bhayshul Tuten's cost seems to be at a point where he needs to hit in order to pay off. But I'm not convinced that the Jags are ready to just give him a full workload. They brought in C-Rod for a reason, and Dobbins being their first choice shouldn't simply erase that fact. Factoring in Lawrence's ability as a rusher as well, is it possible that we're getting too take-locked into the narrative that hashtag all roads lead to Bhayshul Tuten, and that it's causing us to overlook the reality that coaches don't always deploy their personnel the way that we in the community think that they should or hope they will? Thanks. I mean, look, of course coaches don't deploy their personnel all the time the way that we want them to. That happens all the time, every year. We're projecting what we think will and should happen, not necessarily what actually does. I'm going to be wrong a lot this year. That's just the nature of fantasy football. But I've noticed that anytime there's like some sort of bit like this, people seem to think that that bit isn't grounded in reality. I started saying all roads lead to Bhayshul Tuten last year as just a fun reference to the fact that I thought eventually Tuten would get his chance. But I don't say something like that or feel that way without actually having data and thoughtfulness behind it. Let's discuss this question item by item. You first say that Tuten's cost seems to be at a point where he needs to hit in order to pay off. I would say that's the case for most players, especially in the earlier rounds. But yes, in order for him to pay off, he probably can't be the RB2 in that backfield behind Chris Rodriguez. Of course I would agree there. And maybe you feel like the other running back bets in that range don't have quite the same type of competition. Maybe you think Quinshad Judkins is a safer bet because Dylan Sampson won't be the Browns' RB1, or Cam Scatterbo versus Tyrone Tracy, or David Montgomery versus Woody Marks. My argument from a competition standpoint is that I don't think Chris Rodriguez is an undeniable talent. We're talking about a day 3 selection, one who went significantly later in his draft than Bhayshul Tuten went in his. And Rodriguez has quite literally never been a high-volume pass catcher throughout his entire career, including college. He's good at breaking tackles. He's good at getting those tough yards, for sure. I think he's a good enough early down runner. But he doesn't have the same big play profile that Tuten has. And he doesn't have the pass-catching profile that Tuten has. Rodriguez has gained 20 or more yards on 1.5% of his career runs. The league average in the NFL during this time, 2.1%. Now, I get it. Tuten didn't do anything in that department last year either. Not until the playoffs. It's a fair counterpoint. Maybe Tuten's also not explosive. I just have a hard time believing a player who ran a 4.32 and who had an 82nd percentile explosive run rate is all of a sudden not explosive at the NFL level. Is it that, or do you just happen to not break a long play on a relatively small sample, which is a sample that included a lot of short yardage work? And that brings me to my next point about Tuten. There's definitely an assumption out there that Chris Rodriguez is going to be the goal line and the short yardage back. Now, that might happen. Again, I think in range of outcomes. But keep in mind that the Jags gave Tuten 7 goal line rushes last year versus Travis Achane's ETN's 12. Proportionally, much more of Tuten's rush attempts came at the goal line than ETN's. Guys, I don't know if I should call him Achane or ETN. You guys let me know in the comments. Tuten converted 5 of those 7 rush attempts. He was great at the goal line. Chris Rodriguez has 7 touchdowns on 19 goal line rushes throughout his career. There were some metrics last year where ETN was better than Tuten. Tuten, remember, was just a rookie. But Tuten had a success rate that was 11 percentage points higher than Travis Achane's. You see how I'm interchanging the names? I know it's confusing. I don't know what to say about his last name. But Tuten's success rate was 11 percentage points higher. He had an EPA per rush that was better. His yards after contact per attempt was 3.31 versus 3.08. That's according to PFF. And by the way, that stat will get cited often with Chris Rodriguez. But Chris Rodriguez wasn't so substantially better than Bhayshul Tuten and yards after contact per attempt last year. He was at 3.46. Again, Tuten was at 3.31. They were both top 15 running backs within that metric. And he was also second on the Commanders in that metric behind Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt. And guys, remember, Bhayshul Tuten was a rookie. All the while, like I said, Rodriguez has never been a high target earner. He's maxed out at a 1.2% target share in a given season in the NFL. Last year, in a split backfield as a first-year player, Bhayshul Tuten was at 2.9%. Rodriguez had a prorated best season reception share in college in the 11th percentile. And his age and schedule-adjusted receiving yards per team pass attempt mark was in the 6th percentile. Meaning, he wasn't giving us the goods as a receiver in college at all. And he hasn't done that in the NFL. At the very least, Tuten was in the 88th and the 61st percentiles within those two metrics. He actually does have some sort of pass-catching backbone. In the end, I really do think that we're looking at a situation where Tuten could inherit last year's ETN role, and Rodriguez could take on Tuten's role. Of course, that could be wrong. Of course, coaches don't just do what we want them to do or what we think they should do. And yes, there were reports that the Jags wanted Dobbins and they settled on Rodriguez. I don't necessarily think that's a surprise, though. They weren't going to go into the season with Bhayshul Tuten and LaQuinn Allen at running back. They needed to add a veteran. They needed another body. But it's also what we're working with the backfield right now. It's what we have to evaluate. This is the competition. And the funny thing is, given cost, I actually don't think Rodriguez is a fade, especially in best ball. Best ball is a great place to draft Chris Rodriguez. I just think in a managed season-long league, I want to swing big. And historically, 5th, 6th round picks, he's at the 5-6 turn right now in non-best ball leagues. Bhayshul Tuten is. Those hit rates are not super strong to begin with. So let's go for that triple, maybe even a home run instead of the single. The last one this week is also from someone named Mike, and it says, "Hey JJ, thanks for tuning into my question. Why are people so low on De'Von Achane? He was a beast last year, and he was in a bad offense. So why are we worried about the offense this year? Make it make sense." So let me first get out of the way that I'm below market with Achane this year. But Achane's also a good example of where best ball and managed season-long ADP don't really align. In best ball, you'll get him at the end of this giant tier of round 2 running backs a lot of times. Like late second round, Achane will fall to. But if you look at ESPN or CBS, he's RB5. Over on Yahoo, he's RB8. That's a lot higher than where he goes in best ball, so keep that in mind. Now, as someone who's been very in on Achane since he's entered the league, the reason I'm more out this year is definitely situation-based. It's not always comfortable being lower on objectively good players, don't get me wrong. But to me, that whole tier of running back is filled with objectively good players. And most of them don't have the instability that Achane's working with. And that's the thing. To me, I think it's too binary to view this offense as just good or bad. Like, yes, last year's Miami offense wasn't very good. I saw a tweet floating around this week from Zach Savage at Zach Savage on Twitter, and it said, fade De'Von Achane because the Dolphins offense is projected to be bottom in the league. And that was in quotes as if it was coming from someone who was saying to fade Achane. But then Zach added, totally fair considering last year Achane put up 20 points per game in an elite Miami offense that finished 25th in points, 26th in yards, 28th in first downs. So it's a sarcastic tweet where he's saying, hey, this Miami team sucked last year on offense, therefore there's no reason to fade Achane if the offense this year is going to suck too. And I get it. But there was a great tweet also on the other side of this from my friend Rich Rebar this week at Lord Reeves on Twitter, where Rich said, the 2025 Dolphins were certainly not a good team, but there seems to be some notions that they were an outright disaster. This was a competitive team. They won 7 games. They were 16th in snaps led, 1 spot behind the Bills. They were 14th in snaps trailing, ahead of the Lions and the Bills, and they even led by double digits at the 7th highest snap rate. The 2026 Dolphins are currently favored in 1 game on their schedule and are on average nearly a touchdown per game underdog. That's 31st in the league. These are not the same environments if that plays out closely to those expectations. I think that's the nuance that we need when we're talking about this offense. I talk about this in the draft guide too. It's very clear that early round running backs tend to underperform when their team environments are bad. And I'm not saying this subjectively. There are preseason metrics that we can look at to form our opinions about team environment. One of them is just straight up win totals. Late rounds Brandon Gadula did research on this just this week on how team totals can impact early round running backs. Because this year we do have a handful of early round running backs with low team win totals. The research is actually pushing me away from being as aggressive as I've been with Ashton Genty, admittedly. But Gadula found that of the 14 running backs in our ADP database who were drafted in the first 2 rounds with team totals of 7 or fewer, only 7% of them exceeded ADP expectation by 4 or more PPR points per game. For context, every other cohort that he looked at, 7.5 to 8.5 win total, 9 to 9.5, or 10 or greater, each of them were at 20% within that metric. The lower group was at 7%. And the low win total backs were worse at exceeding expectation, period. Just 29% of them beat their ADP expectation in points per game. Every other group was above 46%. Meanwhile, in the draft guide, I analyzed team environment scores. Essentially a score given to a running back based on where his teammates are going in fantasy drafts, based on their average draft positions. And what I found was that we've had 14 running backs who were top 10 running backs since 2014 who had a team environment score below 75, which that's an arbitrary number. You don't need to worry about that. But De'Von Achane finds himself in this bucket this year. 12 of those 14 backs played 8 or more games in the season that we're analyzing, and only 3 of them outperformed ADP expectation. The average back underperformed by 2 PPR points per game, and as a group, they averaged fewer than 15 PPR points per game. We have a ton of variability here. We don't know what Malik Willis is. We don't have to say Willis won't check down, but we can absolutely say we have no freaking clue. Does that mean it could end up being a great fit? For sure. But again, look at all the other running backs and even the wide receivers going in that 1-2 turn area of drafts. There's either just as good of a talent profile or there's a far better situation without this volatility. This really goes back to just how I view fantasy football in general. When I sit and I say that I'm lower than the market on a player, it doesn't mean that I'm incapable of seeing the upside case. Achane could get peppered with targets in a bad offense that's going to see negative game scripts. I'm simply weighing the range of outcomes here to the best of my ability. And my conclusion is that I can't pay an RB5 type price tag for De'Von Achane this year. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening this week, everyone. Greatly appreciate it. I'll talk to you next week.
I'm U.S. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy.
We all seem to be in a rush these days, from work to driving our kids around. But when you're behind the wheel, please do not speed. A few minutes saved by going faster is never worth the risk. So follow the speed limit, enjoy the drive, maybe bring some snacks for the kids, and know that along the way, you're getting quality time with your family.
Paid for by NHTSA.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.